Hi everyone, it's Melissa, and these are my reviews and rankings for the Booktube Prize Semifinals, and I am judging Nonfiction Group A. I have finished 3 out of the 6 books, so I am going to talk about those before they are too far removed from memory, and then I'll come back when I finished the final 3. So the first book that I finished was Paradise Falls, the true story of an environmental catastrophe by Keith O'Brien. This book details the backstory of Love Canal, the chemical disaster that happened there, how that came to be, what different groups were doing in terms of taking responsibility or shirking responsibility, namely the chemical company, the municipality, specifically like the school district that allowed a school to be built on top of this chemical landfill. It details how the community reacted to all this, how the government did or didn't act, how federal bodies and like state or local bodies were trying to pass the buck, it seemed, and it details, so it covers all of that kind of backstory, so you do get a pretty good picture of what had happened, but it focuses a lot of energy on the activists in the community, specifically one activist, Lois Gibbs, although it does talk about others. I think the book was really interesting. I liked that it did kind of detail the different players, I guess you could say, the community, the activism, the government, the company, and I liked that. I did think at times it went off on a couple of different tangents where I didn't really want to be, so I think it could have been better focused in a couple of spots, but I think overall it was really interesting. I had heard of Love Canal. I think it's one of those things that is just kind of out there in like common knowledge, but I didn't really know the specifics of what had happened there. So I think it's a good primer for that, but it gives enough detail if you were familiar with the basic story. There's enough other stuff to kind of flesh out that story. So I think overall it's a really great read and would recommend it. The second book I finished is Song of the Cell by Siddhartha Mukherjee. This book, I think, was good. I think a lot of the information in it is interesting. It's about like the history of the cell, kind of through the lens of our discovery and our learning about the cell. It is more or less chronological, so it starts with the like invention of microscopes and discovery of the cell, moving on to the discovery of organelles within the cell and how we figured out the functions of those different organelles, how we figured out how cells, different cells in the body work together, us understanding the germ theory of disease. And a lot of that information is interesting. Where I think this book went from good instead of being great was that I'm not sure who the audience for this book is. For the most part, especially the early sections of the book, it is using layman's terms and seems to be for an audience who is interested in science but might not know a lot about cells or organelles or how humans discovered these things and what we had learned about them and continue to learn about them. But even though it seems to be built as something for laymen, something for people just learning about cells who want to know the basics of our understanding of cells, for a book that seems to be trying to do that, it does get lost in details in a lot of places. I didn't think it was overly jargony, but there were just times when I was reading it thinking, we didn't really actually need that acronym, or we didn't actually really need that extra bit of detail because this is now starting to muddy the waters, or this feels a little superfluous, that the audience for this book is going to get lost in these details or is going to start to lose focus on the beginning of the sentence or paragraph because you're getting into all of this extra information. There was a lot of interesting information in it, but I don't think it had really figured out who it was talking to. And the third book I've read is My Fourth Time We Drowned, Seeking Refuge on the World's Deadliest Migration Route by Sally Hayden. She's a journalist, a foreign correspondent who has spent her career really looking into immigration and migration and refugees, and specifically around the northern part of Africa. This book is about the migration of people from different countries in Africa towards the north, and also people from the north seeking refuge into Europe across the sea, and how deadly that is, not just at that point, but the routes that they have to take even to get to, say, Libya. The information is really well presented. It's also really well written. I think that she doesn't hold back where it's important, but at the same time kind of meets out the information at a pace where you can digest it. That being said, this is a really, really difficult read. I listened to this on audiobook. I'll make sure that the narrator is posted in the description below. And I think it was after the prologue, directly after the prologue or introduction, there was real audio clips from some of these detention centers, war zones, where you can hear panicked voices. I think some of these clips might have been phone calls or WhatsApp messages or something like that sent to Sally asking for aid. It was really hard to listen to. You can hear children crying and screaming in the background. So just that little bit of a warning that that's hard to listen to. The descriptions of what's happening to people who are seeking refuge and trying to flee horrible situations is difficult to listen to. It's a lot to take in, but like I said, I think she does a good job of trying to present the information in a way that you can digest it in chunks, but it is hard. While she's giving you kind of the political information and trying to explain what's happening, she provides that for context, but this book really focuses on the people, the humanity of it. She chooses a few people as representatives or as examples to tell the story of what's happening in different countries or the different types of routes people can take trying to get to Europe. Refugees have been and continue to be so dehumanized. Hearing that human story takes away that pitfall of looking at just the numbers. This human element was a big part of this book. Another big part of the book was being critical of the UN's failures and corruption, really. So yeah, excellent. Nothing negative to say about this one. I have read the last 3 books in my group, and book number 4 was Eating to Extinction by Dan Saladino. This book breaks down how humans have created these food systems, these agricultural systems that put biodiversity at risk, that put us at risk. The book is split up into sections, so there's a section on fruit, a section on grains, a section on meat, a section on fish and seafood, a section on cheese, and the examples that he chose were all super interesting. Why these particular species, particular types of foods might not exist in the very near future. The author details the reasons why these foods are becoming at risk of extinction. For most of them, it relates back to colonialism, bringing in other crops that colonizers want to grow, and how that's pushed endemic food crops to the fringes. And another reason that pops up a lot is capitalism and desire to keep increasing food yields. But then, of course, there's a downside to that. I think if you want to understand the Green Revolution and its implications to our agricultural systems, then this is definitely a must-read. My only criticism with this book, and it's a pretty minor one, it did seem to stretch out a bit. It seemed a little long. I could tell that he was trying to hit every kind of major type of food, but also he was trying to find stories that were distinct enough, hit foods from different parts of the world as well. And even though each food had its distinct story, the themes of how it's become endangered is repetitive in places. So that's my really only critique of this book, is that I feel like it was overly long and a bit repetitive in parts, but I enjoyed reading it very much. Book number 5 that I read was Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. This is by Matthew F. Delmont, and I listened to it on audiobook, narrated by William DeMeritt. This book tells the story of Black soldiers and other jobs in the military, not just soldiers, but soldiers, the military, Black activists, lawyers, leading up to the Second World War, during the Second World War, and kind of in the immediate aftermath of the war. As the title suggests, this book tackles both what Black Americans were doing abroad on the front lines of the Second World War, but also what Black activists and Black civilians were doing in the US fighting for civil rights. I really appreciated how succinct this book was. I thought it was very focused, even though it kind of had both of these things going on, talking about kind of the more military side fighting World War II, and also politically and socially what was going on in the United States at the time. I think a lot of care was taken to connect those things, and how you really couldn't separate what was happening abroad and at home. It had an idea of what it wanted to say, and I think it executed it very well. And book number 6 was The Facemaker by Lindsey Fitzharris. This book is a medical history and a biography of Harold Gillies, I hope that's how you pronounce his name, documenting his time as a surgeon during World War I, doing facial reconstruction on soldiers. He essentially pioneered, not plastic surgery, because plastic surgery existed, but not to this extent. He really pioneered a lot of methods and standardized techniques for facial reconstruction. And so he was a pioneer of plastic surgery, especially facial reconstruction. And World War I soldiers were coming home to Britain with absolutely horrendous facial injury. Nothing had been seen like that to that scale. Just completely horrendous facial injuries from industrialized war. This particular doctor was, I think, revolutionary in a way, in that while other surgeons were also pioneering and working on different techniques and fine-tuning, this surgeon was unique in that he seemed to be really the only one using a multidisciplinary approach, whereas other surgeons were working maybe with another surgeon or a team of surgeons. He was working with dentists to learn more about the jaw and bone grafting and getting the teeth right to help with speech and eating and restoring more function to the face, and was working with artists like sculptors and someone who would make sketches of the before, during, and after of the faces to really capture details that black and white photography couldn't capture at the time. I didn't rank this as highly as some other of the books on the list, not because it wasn't really interesting and a good book, but I found the writing not as impressive as the writing in some of the other books, but would still recommend this one. So my number 6 was Song of the Cell. This was the only one that I thought was subpar compared to the other books. I don't think it was bad. It was fine, but I think it struggled with the audience for it. Yeah, so that was my problem with it, and I think it was just a little too tedious as compared to the other books. At number 5, I put Paradise Falls. I think, again, this is a good book, but it lost focus in parts, and I think it just needed a bit of restructuring, or maybe cutting out a couple parts to focus the story more. At number 4, I put The Facemaker. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was so interesting, but I think the writing just wasn't as good as the top 3. At number 3, I put Eating to Extinction. It was a really interesting book. I just think it was probably a bit too long and repetitive in places, but I found all of the examples he gave fascinating, and it didn't feel tedious to read at any point. At number 2, I put Half American. I liked how focused this book was and how it made the connections between what was happening abroad and in the US, and making the links, I think just was really well done. Number 1 for me was My Fourth Time We Drowned. I have no notes for this book. I think it was super well written. I think it was one of those books that's just really important to read. I think it really lays things out on the table that people may not realize about migration and refugees and what is happening in Northern Africa and Europe and with the UN. And yeah, I just think that I couldn't find fault with it. So those are my rankings. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to know your opinions. Please leave a comment below. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll chat soon. Take care. Bye.